Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Ricardo Salvador. As the Senior Scientist and Director of the Food and Environment Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, Ricardo Salvador has over 4 decades of experience working with citizens, scientists, economists, and politicians to transition our current food system into one that grows healthy foods while employing sustainable and socially equitable practices. Before coming to UCS, Dr. Salvador served as a program officer for food health and well-being with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. In this capacity, he was responsible for conceptualizing and managing the foundation's food systems programming. He partnered with colleagues to create programs that address the connections between food and health, environment, economic development, sovereignty, and social justice. He advises a range of scientific advocacy and social justice organizations, including the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, the International Panel of Experts in Sustainable Food, the Land Institute, the Center for Good Food Purchasing, FoodCorps, and the Heal Food Alliance, among others. So without further ado, Dr. Ricardo Salvador.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you very much, Colin and Sada and everyone involved with making this possible for the gracious invitation. I can't tell you how flattered I am. It isn't just that I've taken a look at the lineup of speakers and subjects that you have for this series, which is just fantastic. I envy all of you that are going to be able to keep up with that and all the learning that's going to be possible as a result of that. It's also that here at the Union of Concerned Scientists, we actually have a fairly long history of very close partnership with Tufts, both across agriculture, food and the environment, and in nutrition policy. And for those of you that are not aware, I just want to make sure to underscore some of those. And actually, as we go along, and maybe even in questions and answers, it'll come up how tightly bound we are, and therefore how close our research and policy agendas are. We have worked, for instance, with Tim Griffin on a number of different projects. He has served as a reviewer and advisor for some of the work that we've done. We've worked with Chris Peters. We've actually depended on research that Chris has done. I'm sorry for Tufts that you all are about to lose him, but of course I'm very happy for the USDA that is going to get his talents. We've also had the opportunity to work hand in hand, some of our analysts with people like Nicole Titchener-Blackstone on your faculty, and Park Wilde, for instance. And so you should gather that we have really close connections with faculty and researchers, but also we've benefited directly from those of you that are students. So we've had interns here, Tessa Saltzman, and Julie Kurtz, who is now at IFPRI, were interns with us a few years back. And of course, one of your alumni, Rebecca Boehm, she was Rebecca Nemec at the time, is now our staff economist here with the Food and Environment team. There are many other connections that I could underscore, but you should see enough there to understand why, to me, it's a real privilege to connect with you. And I have a purpose in actually underscoring how closely connected we are with you, because I know where you end up as graduates. And because I know the influence of your researchers and your administrators, for me, it's a real opportunity to be able to speak with you about both big picture items as well as the policy specifics that the title of this webinar have promised. I will end up talking about those so that, you know, this isn't false advertising, but I want to calibrate this talk to take advantage of the fact that I know that I'm speaking to an audience of very influential people, either right now or who will be very influential in the future because of all of the places that you're going to end up. So just so that I don't lose the punchline here, let me tell you that I do want to end up with some very specific, even pragmatic policy recommendations around, for instance, the initiative on food as medicine that Dean Mozaffarian and others at Tufts are leading. I think that is a very topical idea. This is the time to be pushing on that notion. I also want to end up talking about one of the topics du jour, which is the opportunity that we have with the current administration on climate change, and of course, the very important role that agriculture can have on mitigating climate change, by which I mean reversing the contributions to climate change that come from agriculture, while avoiding the swan song of carbon markets and the pitfalls that come along with commoditizing carbon and creating whole false economies around counting carbon. So I want to tell you that I'm going to end up there, but I'm not going to start out there. I actually want to beg your indulgence to go into much broader view, so broad that you're going to wonder whether you came to the wrong webinar initially. So I want you to be patient with me, because I promise you that I will connect this initial big picture topic to things that you worry about, just so that I don't let it go. As an example of why this is an opportunity for me to inject some big picture notions with this particular audience, with no particular reason. At the beginning of this week, I had the opportunity to speak with Mim Nelson about the work that she's now leading at Newman's Own Foundation. So one of your recent faculty and administrators who, together with other folks in nutrition and policy, have had huge influence in terms of dietary guidelines and other nutrition policies at the federal level. So this is why I'm going to do everything I can to take advantage of what is an opportunity for me, and you're going to have to pay for that. So let me really shift gears here. I want to explain to you why this complete turn leftwards compared with what you may be expecting. It is that most of our concerns on a daily basis are very parochial. I'm speaking as human beings, and this translates into our professional concerns. And I want to zoom out to the big picture to sort of cleanse us of that parochial filter for the things that we're going to end up talking about, which is nutrition and agriculture policy. Almost a week ago on Friday, the columnist Alan Giebert, who writes for the Agricultural Trade Press in Illinois, did a very nice column where he was actually summarizing the writer of an Iowan who's now at Yale, who did a nice little essay on the cost of soil erosion to the future. And Alan Giebert had a couple of wonderful lines in his essay. One of the lines was, people who eat in the future will have a lot of questions for those of us in the present time. And one of his ending lines was this: who do we blame for not farming in the way that we know we should? Which to me is such a mouthful, because of the fact that our current practice and science knows much better about how we should be producing our food and what food we should be producing than we actually see reflected in the real world. So whom do we blame? Well, I'm going to give you a facile answer here, and that is that we need to blame, let me just give you one straw argument here, economic thinking. But I don't want the economists in the crowd to be alarmed or feel attacked. I see economics as an example of motivated reasoning, meaning that it's serving a purpose that we all need it to serve, and has elevated such notions as efficiency. We worship efficiency, the substitutability of resources, such things as economy of scale, which are so highly regarded in the iconography of economics that you've got to be wondering, how in the world can you criticize the notion of efficiency of all things? Are you going to advocate for us to be inefficient? So I'll hopefully keep your interest by telling you that I do want to come back to that and justify that. But remember that question, whom do we blame for not farming in the way that we know we should? And now let's zoom out to the big picture. There's a joke that academics like to begin with a big bang and really explain everything. And to your great detriment, I am really going to begin with a big bang. That's what I meant by big picture. So, this is the cosmological event that is as far as current science, which is positivistic, meaning it measures the things that can be seen and touched and for which there's evidence. It's as far as science can inform us about our past. The methods of science don't work beyond whatever preceded the Big Bang. So this occurred about 13.8 billion years before the present. billion years before the present is going to be the time scale that I'm going to use to do a very quick timeline travel with you to bring us to the present. So as far as we know, the beginning of everything that we understand is 13.8 billion years before the present. So that Big Bang, as the name indicates, it released massive amounts of energy, which over billions of years accreted into lower quality energy and into matter. And so it wasn't until about 4.5 billion years ago that our solar system, our most immediate neighborhood, accreted into matter, so that we have the recognizable solar system that we are all familiar with now. So remember the contrast, 13.8 billion years from the Big Bang to the accretion of the solar system as we know it now at 4.5 billion years ago. After that, our planet began to cool. And about a billion years after that cooling phenomenon began, we have the first evidence that single-celled life came into existence 3.5 billion years ago. It took a little bit more than a billion years for multicellular life to show up, about 1.2 billion years before the present. So this is photosynthetic bacteria, blue-green bacteria. So that means that that's the period when we begin to get oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis injected into the atmosphere, which would eventually make multicellular heterotrophic life possible on the planet, 1.2 billion years before the present. So first animal life, heterotrophic life, 0.75 billion years before the present. It happened to be sponges. And from there, with the progress of time, it was about 0.45 billion years before the present, before that life transferred from the single-celled photosynthetic blue-green bacteria into multi-celled organisms that had captured some of those blue-green bacteria into their own structure and became what today we call plants. First, we had photosynthetic algal mats on the surface of the earth, and then eventually the evolution of what today we regard to be the vascular higher plants. So by 0.75 billion years before present, you can imagine that having taken place. And it wasn't until about 0.45 billion years before the present that we can recognize what today we would call animal life. Very different from the complicated animals that now roam the planet, but the initiation of those animals on Earth, on actual land surfaces, was about 0.45 billion years before the present. Now let's make a real big jump to the point where those of us self-interested humans might think that things actually really began. And it was essentially just a short blink ago in the geological timescale that I've been describing to you that we became what today we call presumptuously modern humans. Physical anthropologists draw the boundary between our hominin predecessors and what we call our modern human state, actually by a number of criteria, but the one that I find the most interesting is the existence of the voice box. Our ability to be able to articulate very specifically so that we could say, you go down the ravine, I'll chase them down the side of the river, we'll converge and kill them over there, which has made us humans. So that occurred about 200,000 years ago. And to keep this in the scale that we're talking about, 2 times 10 to the minus 4 billion years ago, essentially a blink of an eye compared to everything else that we've talked about. We just showed up on the scene. And then this behavior that we're gathered to talk about today, which is agriculture, which is essentially we as rational human beings decided that we were not going to accept the limitations that every other living being on the planet lives by, which is that our population levels are constrained by the natural carrying capacity of our environment. When we decide that we're not going to be limited by the natural carrying capacity of our environment and we're going to overcome that, we become agricultural. That's about 10,000 years ago, as you know. And an important hallmark of how we've been doing that is that just about 160 years ago, we went from living within our caloric means, within our energetic means, sunlight that we could harvest and turn into food, and therefore power our bodies in all human activities, changed from concurrent calories to fossil calories, things that we could dig up, carbon that we brought up from the earth, used, and then blew up into the atmosphere. So again, in keeping with the timeline that we've been talking about here, that's 1.6 times 10 to the minus 7 billion years before the present. So we've just learned how to do that. So we just showed up. We are just learning how to perform agriculture, and willy-nilly, we're blowing carbon out into the atmosphere in order to satisfy the agricultural lifestyle, which is to live beyond our means, both in terms of the natural carrying capacity of our respective biomes, as well as in terms of caloric requirement. So we're doing a very unnatural thing. This is the big picture, and we're learning the costs and consequences of that unnatural thing that we're doing. Now, let me switch gears on you and talk about those consequences. The people that study this at that real big picture scale are astrobiologists. The large scale story that I just told you comes from astrophysics. But those who actually add this standing redox reaction that we call life to the picture, that additional layer, these are astrobiologists. And they ask questions such as, how likely is it that the story here on Earth has repeated on other planets around the known universe? So I'm going to tell you a little bit of a tale. It's called the Astrobiological Perspective. The main astrobiologist responsible for this is a researcher by the name of Adam Frank, if you want to pursue this on your own. And I highly recommend that you do. He's a very effective popular science writer. And so here's the astrobiological perspective. It has to be preceded by my explaining to you how we can make estimates about the likelihood that the story here on Earth might be played out in other parts of the universe. Some of you may be familiar with the fact that an astrophysicist by the name of Francis Drake came up with an equation back in the 60s, which is really more of a heuristic to help us approximate, first order approximation, what the answer might be to how many other civilizations that are able to communicate across the vast expanse of space, or as the astrophysicists would say, within our present cone of light. And if you're not familiar with the Drake equation, it goes something like this. We're trying to estimate n, where n is the number of civilizations that have been able to develop interstellar communication. And it's a very reasonable approximation. It starts out by trying to figure out the number of stars that there are, then the number of stars that have planets orbiting them, then the number of those planets that are in the Goldilocks zone, not too warm, not too cold, to allow for water to exist, a precondition for life, at least as we know it, major assumption of the calculation. And then the amount of time required for civilizations to develop on those planets that would have the technological capacity to emit signals into space, and then such factors as the duration of time over which they're emitting those signals, which is an important temporal dimension to allow for us to receive those signals. So I won't go deeper into that. I just wanted to give you enough of a snapshot so that you understand it's a reasonable way of coming up with an approximation. Now you realize, because that is a linear multiplicative function, you're reducing the number each time you add a fraction to that. If any one of those components is 0, then the probability of another planet like ours is likewise 0. It's a fascinating philosophical point. The fact that we exist means that that probability is higher than 0. Now, just so that you know, one of the estimates, there's a broad range of estimates because each one of those terms cannot be known absolutely. You make assumptions about a lot of them, or you approximate a lot of them. So the spectrum of possibilities is very large. But one of the possibilities, just so that you have an idea of the magnitude, is that there could be as many as 15.6 million planets like ours out in the known universe within our cone of light. In other words, enough to make it a reasonable expectation that we should be able to detect regular patterned communications from other civilizations like ours. And yet, in spite of the fact that we've been looking since the late 1950s. Crickets. Why are we alone? Why hasn't the story that I've just described to you been happening on other planets as well? This is where Adam Frank's astrobiological perspective comes in. And it essentially goes something like this. Any civilization that develops high technology is obviously going to be burning a lot of energy. in essence, to do all of the anti-entropic things that we're doing on the planet. So essentially, anything that we build, anything that would be happening in nature on its own that we reverse, which would take energy, every one of those things by definition. Any highly technological civilization is burning through energy. They've found a way to enter into the neocaloric era that we're in as of the discovery of the Drake Well in Pennsylvania in the 1860s. So that means that they're expending a lot of wasted heat. And just to remind you of your kinetics, if that argument doesn't make sense, anytime that we expend heat, it is impossible to make a perfect conversion of that heat to translate it into work. And so there's a certain amount of that heat which is released as sensible heat. We feel it as warmth. So that's why when you stand by a car engine, you have learned not to put your hand on the engine block, because all of the energy that's not going into rotating the axle in that car is being released as the sensible heat that's warming the engine block. So it's the inefficiency of the conversion of that energy. So the more energy we are burning for technological purposes, the more heat we're emitting. Well, we've learned about this, and we call this climate change these days, in spite of all the puny motivated reasoning denying it. We're now at the point where we recognize what we're doing. We're boiling ourselves to death. So here's the astrobiological perspective, finally the punchline. Adam Frank proposes it isn't really that we have always been lonely. It's just that we're real technological laggards. One possibility to explain why we're not receiving signals anymore from other smart civilizations in other corners of the universe is that they went through their development curve very quickly, and they're no longer around. They boil themselves to death. High technology civilizations tend to destroy themselves, and that has happened on those 15 million, 15.6 million other planets where there was a possibility that Earth's story has also been repeating. So here we are, the laggards, we're coming along really slow, and here's this quiz that we're all facing. It's an existential quiz. Are we smart enough, A, to realize what's happening to us, and B, to do something about it so that we prevent our own perishing in the way that is reasonable to assume may have already happened in other corners of the universe? And agriculture, our way of actually denying the population dynamics that every other living being on the planet lives by, is directly tied to that, because we actively burn fossil fuel in order to create the fertilizers, in order to produce the rations, the feed by which we produce beef. And as you know, that contribution, depending on how far you go into the processing of that food to convert it into edible bites that all of us are accustomed to recognizing in restaurants or in grocery stores, can account for about maybe 10% of all industrial greenhouse gas emissions if we just restrict it to the production component, to as much as 30 to 45% of all industrial emissions, again, depending on how much you're taking into account and what life cycle models you're utilizing. In any case, it is not trivial, meaning that if we can reverse that, agriculture can make huge contributions towards mitigating anthropogenic climate change and helping with this existential quiz around whether we're smart enough to figure out what's happening to us and do something about it to prevent it. Now, that's a really big question. This is a question that all humanity needs to be convinced of in order to take the united action that as a globe we need to take. And we are far from demonstrating that we can be unified around anything, even something as critical as the survival of the human species on the planet. So I want to give you some examples of that. I want to quote to you from Stephen Hawking. He was an astrophysicist, as many of you may know, particularly well known for defining the concept of a black hole. It had been predicted by physicists for about 100 years, but he was the astrophysicist who most carefully defined what it is and what its properties are. Just so that you know what his standing is in the firmament of astrophysics, if you're not particularly familiar with him. But he was a brilliant man. And this is what he said about this issue in a TEDx or an actual TED conference that he gave in 2008. Let me just quote this to you directly. Our only chance of long-term survival is not to remain lurking on planet Earth, but to spread out into space? The answers to these big questions show that we have made remarkable progress in the last 100 years. But if we want to continue beyond the next 100 years, our future is in space. That is why I am in favor of manned, or should I say, personed spaceflight. Now, you can see all of the things that are packed into this brief statement that I quoted to you from Stephen Hawking. He obviously made the assessment in 2008 that humanity was not smart enough to continue to live viably on planet Earth, that all of the vectors that determine our survivability were pointing in the wrong direction, and therefore what we needed to do was to escape. Now, we're a population, that's over 7 billion, approaching 8 billion. Obviously, not all of us are going to be able to escape into space. Think of all of the delicious questions that come from following Stephen Hawking's proposition here. The one that I find the most delicious is, well, if we had the perfect home on Earth defined by the place that spawned us, the place that we co-evolved with, the place that we are perfectly adapted to, so that you don't think I'm being teleological about that. If we had the perfect home here and we made a mess of it, how does that indicate that, say, if we escape to Mars, we're going to do any better there? What knowledge are we going to be taking that's going to allow us not to replicate the same mess there? That's a delicious question. But other delicious questions emerge, such as, well, okay, who's going to go? And who's going to get to stay and boil to death? And who makes those decisions? And we already have some peeks into answering those questions. So, for instance, you all are familiar with Elon Musk's SpaceX project. You're familiar with Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin project. You're familiar with Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic project. They've all achieved suborbital travel. They're preparing to go commercial, offering people personed space travel. And they've all stated that their objective is actually to escape the bounds of Earth. And these are the richest people on planet Earth, and this is how they're thinking. So in terms of who's going to go, who's going to be saved, who's making those decisions, I actually probably didn't even need to give you those real life examples. You probably could have guessed just from Earth's history. So let's come back to agriculture again. You can see why, or at least I hope you can see, why walking through that is a useful instrument to get us to expand away from the usual parochial perspective we have, say, on carbon policy, and the other questions that we ask about agricultural nutrition policy as well. So let me descend now from the clouds, literally, and try to make the connections. Agriculture from its inception has never made economic sense. Agriculture from its inception, from the standpoint of the narrative that anthropologists have been able to unravel, has always been about exploiting people and exploiting nature. That is its intrinsic characteristic. It means there's always been an elite that's been exploiting other people to do the most menial work, and that's never been remunerated economically. That actually was a laughable proposition at the outset, and it remains a laughable proposition. If you doubt that claim, think about the argument that we should be paying today's farm workers so that they have the same benefits that all of us expect when we do white collar work, that they should be paid overtime, that they should expect workman's compensation, that they should have retirement programs, that they should have medical benefits. To most people in agriculture, that is a laughable proposition. Why? Because it used to be enslaved people that did this. By definition, we created a racial taxonomy. We just invented it out of thin air to justify that there are some people that are less than, that therefore do the work that we consider to be less than, and they're not entitled to anything than less than. That persists in the modern agricultural business model. It shows up when people argue that you can't pay people more because what? Food is going to cost more. And here we come to the motivated reasoning of economics that I was alluding to at the top of the conversation. So let's say that we had a magic wand and that we could try to reverse 10,000 years of exploitative agricultural history. By the way, the economics of agriculture still do not work. As you all know, last year, the federal government propped up commodity agriculture, the largest scale agriculture, the largest by volume agricultural practices in this nation, by $60 billion. If you think that's gilding the lily, because it was a unique case, the federal administration was basically politically assuring its electorate, and we need to go beyond that, then in a typical year, the annual expenditure, even though it nominally should be about $5 billion a year to support agriculture through Farm Bill programs, it actually turns out to be about $11 billion a year. So this is still propping up the system. On its own, it doesn't work. With the false and facile explanation that it is to support an ostensibly cheap food policy, when in fact the majority of what that is supporting is not food at all. It is part of the business model of large conglomerates and many actual monopolies that are essentially turning public dollars into private gain. Now, this is the apparatus that we actually need to try to understand. And if we had a magic wand to try to undo this, let me just jump right to the core of what I would love to see. Just as we don't believe that anyone should own oxygen, because it's a requirement for life, we should recognize that food should be a human right, that it should not be in the private sector. And the reason why I went to great lengths to explain that the economy of agriculture has always been exploitative from its inception, it never worked, and why it still persists with those vivid examples that I've just given you, is so that you don't fear this notion that food is a human right that doesn't belong in the private sector. It should be a responsibility of the public sector to make sure that all of us are nourished, that we don't leave it up to the vagaries of where we're born, what families we were born to, what our socioeconomic status are, that we all have access to nourishing, thriving food supply from the moment that we come onto the planet. Because to some that will sound like it's the curse of socialism. This is a broader discussion, but there is no more socialized sector of the economy right now than present agriculture. So I wanted to expand your mind with that realization before popping that idea on you. If you want to hear more about this idea, the economist that I know that has expanded it the most is John Eichert. You can look up his essay on food as a public utility, where he essentially talks about other instances where we want to make sure that every person in the country has access to basic infrastructure services, light, power, water, sewage services, where there's really no advantage and no real efficiencies in setting up private sector companies to compete against each other, because they will naturally prefer certain markets where they can make greater profit. And we actually want publicly regulated utilities that make water, light, sewage accessible to all of us. So we have regulated utilities to deliver those services, and food should be exactly that, which means that food production should not be in the private domain. That would take away conglomerates, monopolies, concentrated production. That would take away their marketing, which creates all these false demands that make us think that food and sweets and highly processed food should be our comfort food, that the cattle population should look to get fat in order to feel better, that then creates this huge burden of disease that we fight in ways that essentially create the moral hazard, where the federal government at the same time is pushing the accelerator and trying to hit the brakes. We do away with that incoherence in federal policy when we realize the right to food as a basic human right. So you can imagine all the things that would be affected by that. And one thing that I'll tell you is that it would affect land tenure. A lot of what is currently done in agriculture is not actually the production of food. In spite of all of the propaganda about how the population is increasing and how we need to push the accelerator on production and that notion of efficiency, the amount of land that we devote to the actual crops that we eat, 77 million acres, just a little bit over 77 million acres. So, cereal, grains, and pulses, the legumes that we eat, the fruits, the vegetables, the nuts, all of those sorts of things, 77 million acres. It is an extremely small fraction of all of the agricultural land. The majority of that land goes into supporting the production of beef. It's grassland, rangeland, and all of the commodity corn, sorghum, soy that goes into creating the rations that goes into feeding those livestock in concentrated animal feeding productions. Research done at Tufts tells us, this is the Chris Peters and Julie Kurtz research and others there, tells us that if by the rationale that we need to consume far less beef, not eliminate meat consumption, but if we ate according to the dietary guidelines, the best recommendations that come from science and medical nutrition, we would need vastly less land in order to produce all of those crops. And think of all of the benefits: less row crop production, more biodiversity, more carbon sequestration, less of a burden of disease, fewer greenhouse gas emissions. We deal with lots of the issues of agriculture inherently, structurally. So that would entail a massive shift in our federal policies, and it would demand that we bring coherence in the policies that touch immigration, labor force, that touch nutrition policy and federal contracts for what food we buy, that touch what we subsidize in terms of agricultural production. And we could keep on going down the line. I could include labor provisions and actually almost every cabinet level agency. Now, I'm going to cut things short there and sort of leave it for you folks to draw out in Q&A what aspects of this you want to rebut or ask questions about. As you can tell, we could write reams of books, or there's a lot of research that could still be done on a lot of the things that I've described to you. But I'm going to cut things short there because the organizers actually do want us to have some time for Q&A. And they also asked me to give you some information, which I normally feel really self-conscious about, but I can understand the request. And it's to explain a little bit about how I ended up doing this work and to tell you a little bit about the Union of Concerned Scientists so that you know a little bit where this perspective is coming from. So before we get into Q&A, let me try to do this as briefly as I can. So the Union of Concerned Scientists began, if you're anywhere near your home campus in Boston, very near you in Cambridge. It was originally created in 1969 by both students and faculty at MIT and at Harvard. And the issue that we're very concerned with about at the time was the proliferation of nuclear weapons. The short story of it is that they were able to do scientific analyses to suggest policies to the then federal administration to back down from some of the plans that they had at that time. For instance, to put a web of nuclear armaments in space, just to give you an idea of what galvanized our creation. And the lesson that the founders of UCS learned was that you can sometimes support policymakers by helping them get out of a corner that they've been backed into by giving them solid scientific rationale that then they can use to come up with better policies than the ones that they formulate due to populist or political pressures elsewhere. So our mission areas have expanded. Our biggest one now is climate change. We have a food and environment team where I work, and where the colleague that I mentioned to you, Rebecca Bain, is our economist, an alumnus of your programs. And we also have a program in clean transportation, which has a goal of eliminating fossil fuel-based transportation. We have a program in science and democracy, which is all around making sure that the integrity of science is respected in federal policy and decision-making in government. And the original legacy program, the global security program, nuclear armaments and nuclear energy, continues to be alive. We now have offices in DC, which is where I'm based, as well as in Chicago and in Oakland. So that's UCS. Well, I should tell you about me. I'm originally from Mexico, and from southern Mexico. And I was raised in a family where my mom was an American missionary who went to Mexico and met a Native American man. And therefore, I was raised in a home where the contrast and the worldview were just on display and required independent thinking and reflection and resolution from the time that I'm conscious. This is a dominantly Catholic country. My mom was and is a fundamentalist evangelical missionary. She came from a wealthy farming family in California. My father's family is a Native American family that did self-provisioning farming, hanging off the hills in the southern state of Mexico. It's called Oaxaca. We in the family spoke Zapotec, the language of the country. Outside the door was Spanish. At home, our mother read us the Bible in English. It's just a very interesting upbringing, which means I just can't look at the world the way anybody else does. I've always been forced to actually figure things out on my own by first principles. And I ended up in agriculture completely by accident. I'm really an accidental scientist. The thing that I wanted to do something about when I was growing up in southern Mexico was the injustice that I saw just within my own family. I saw these wealthy farmers on my mother's side of the family that everything appeared to be going well for them. They were dairy farmers, very well materially. And I didn't see any difference with my farming family in southern Mexico, my Zapotec family. Just as smart, just as hardworking, just as entrepreneuring. But my father's side of the family was actually forced off the farms when I was young and onto the migrant trail and became vegetable pickers in California. And I thought it was extremely unjust that they were materially poor and essentially were forfeiting their lives picking vegetables, telling us, their children, we're doing this so that you don't have to be poor and you don't have to make the choices we're making. And I wanted to do something about that, and I didn't know what. And this was the era of the Green Revolution, which, as you know, it had its heyday in Mexico. I was a young man when Borlaug won the Nobel Prize. My dad lionized him, and I drank the Kool-Aid that it was about lack of technical knowledge that farmers were poor, and therefore I needed to learn about technical knowledge that I could bring to my family. And there's this lyric from John Lennon that says that life is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans. And I'm the embodiment of that, because by the time I figured out I had a really wrong analysis and that I really was about fighting racial and social injustice, I was a faculty member in agronomy at Iowa State. I was in the middle of my career. So I've migrated from there, fortunately. There was tremendous benefit to that career trajectory because no one can tell me that I don't understand agriculture. You might fight my ideas, you might dismiss or marginalize what I have to say. You can't tell me that I don't understand either how agriculture or farming in the Midwest works, or how science, agricultural science works. So the debate needs to take place on other grounds, but not that I don't understand that world. So if a place like UCS did not exist, which is a science-based policy advocacy, I would have to invent it because it's the perfect home. I'm just a born advocate for the reasons that I've described, and I'm a scientist. I believe in being rational and using the logical positivistic model in order to determine what is the best for all of us. So I wasn't planning on sharing any of that, but the organizer asked me to explain that because I understand that as students, many of you may actually be interested in how people end up where they were. And sadly, I can't give you a prescription to end up where you want to be. My own experience is that it was all just an accident. But if you're conscious as you pick the lily pads that you're skipping on during the various stages of your career, rather than waking up and doing something one day that's completely contrary to what you want to devote your life to, hopefully you won't be too far from the thing you want to do and be able to take just one or two more steps and actually end up where you want to be, which fortunately is what happened for me in UCS. So with that, Kevin, I'll pass it back to you for moderation.
Wow. Thank you, Ricardo. We got an astrobiological perspective on maladaptive agricultural practices resulting in this pretty massive proclamation that food should be a human right and not belong in a private sector. That's some territory to cover. And I think where it landed is particularly fascinating, and that's where a lot of the Q&A is coming in. So I'm going to read through a few questions, and I might try to combine a couple in the interest of time. So first from Kathy Stanton, as some billionaires are working on escaping planet Earth, others, like Bill Gates, are buying up as much of its farmland as they can. Can you comment on that and how an equitable ag policy should respond? And then let me just tack on a question to that from Shana as well, that asks us as consumers and students interested in ag and policy, how we might be involved in addressing some of these issues as well.
Yeah. Boy, okay. So that may take all the time that we have. I hate to frighten you with that, but there's a lot in there. So Gates is a technologist. I'm going to skip very quickly through this. I'm very familiar with both what he's doing, what his foundation did, because I spent some time within the world of philanthropy. And when they started their food program, they called us at the Kellogg Foundation to give them advice on what they should be doing. So I know that internal to their foundation, the culture is, we change the world once in 10 years, we can do it again. What they meant was that within 10 years, we went from people asking, what is a computer, to everybody believing they needed a computer on their desk to do anything. So Gates believes that if you're sufficiently clever, you can come up with a technological solution to any challenge that humankind has. So he's applied that to immunization in South Asia and Africa, where he's done a great deal of good. He's attempted to do that with agriculture, and he's now attempting to do that with climate change. The problem is that, ironically, because I told you that I'm a scientist myself and logical positivist about this thing, it is insufficient. Science itself is a human artifact, subject to all of the fallibilities of human beings. That it's got some built-in self-protection mechanisms so that we don't fool ourselves. But think about all of the questions that science has to address. First of all, why are we going to study something? Why are we going to study something depends on who's asking the question. So who's asking the question? Why do they want to know the answer to those questions? Who's going to benefit to the results of from the results of the research? Who's going to be hurt? Are they the same people? So you can see all of those are subjective questions. So you can apply the science and be very rigorous about it, but the envelope is extremely socially determined. So this is what Mr. Gates is doing. He doesn't have sufficient information because he's not factoring in actually something that I'll steal just from the US Constitution, which is this notion of the general welfare. So anytime that we take an action, we should have a screen that asks us who is going to benefit, who is going to be hurt, and is the general welfare going to be served? You remember this claim I made about economics being an example of motivated reasoning? A lot of times the economic justifications that we use for decisions that we make at the policy level or at the business level lead us to rationalize or lead us to justify and believe that because we can document a benefit in one corner of the economy, that is a net good, without actually comprehending what the total ripple effects are throughout society. We're in the middle of a racial reckoning where a big component of that is actually realizing and acknowledging that in making a lot of those decisions, we've actually left a lot of people out. And it is not that we could not have included all of those people. We made explicit decisions. I gave you one example, labor and immigration policy in agriculture. We knew exactly what we were doing. We knew exactly who we were doing to. We have exemptions in labor law that make it clear we knew exactly whom we didn't want to benefit from the way that we perform agriculture. So Mr. Gates, wittingly or not, is falling into that pattern. He can see a way in which you can get into this false economy of carbon counting that I was talking about, and it makes piles of money for some people. So to him, that's a net good, in his technological view of the world. Now, how all of us can participate in this, I need to always pull us back to the big arc. There is this interesting experiment on the general welfare in the United States that's been happening that we need to understand in historical perspective. I think I can summarize it very quickly. This nation, which is a colonist nation, European people basically taking over the land of other people just a few hundred years ago, emerged because of big political waves that occurred in Europe around this big question. The big question was, can we govern ourselves? Do we necessarily need to be governed by a king, by an all-powerful monarch, whether beneficent or not? And the people that established this country took ideas of the social phenomenon known as the Enlightenment that claimed, no, we don't need autocratic government. We know how to govern ourselves. The people can govern themselves. So you all know the complicated gears and pulleys that they put into place in order to prove that we know how to govern ourselves. So the separation of powers, the stuff we all learn in civics about the supposed balance among the three branches of government and so on. And we're living through a test right now around whether all of those systems that they put in place are actually workable to prove that we know how to govern ourselves as the people. And political scientists tell us we're far off course right now. The political science shows us that the actual government that we have at the moment is a plutocracy. meaning the bills that Congress tends to pass, that Congress is on average millionaires. So they, their networks, their friends, their interests, the worldview that makes sense to them tend to favor the upper quintile in income in the United States. That's the definition of a plutocracy. So that's the actual government that we have. So what do we do? The question that you asked to tail into that. What do we do as students, researchers, eaters, and so on? Let me give you an example of something that we're living through right now. And again, this comes from a principle of political science. There is a famous group that just 2 weeks ago announced that they're now up to 43 different members. The Food and Agriculture Climate Alliance was organized initially by the Farm Bureau. There's a front group in front of that, but the Farm Bureau was basically the organizer of this. They've famously been climate denialists. When it became pretty clear to them about a couple of years ago, at least, that climate change was going to be undeniable and that there was an opportunity for agriculture to be able to make a claim to both adapt and mitigate climate change. This is me saying this, I'll just own this. They saw the next big federal gravy train. And so they did a 180-degree turn, and now they're all about climate change. They want to line up for these carbon markets and all of the other ways in which the federal government can now feed them through ostensive programs to deal with climate change. Now, here's why they do this. Within the world of the agribusiness conglomerates, many of them are at their necks. For instance, just to give you one example, the cattlemen, the beef growers, are at the necks of the corn growers and all of their ethanol. They have interests that are contrary to each other. Corn growers want high corn prices, beef feeders want low corn prices, but they unite. So those are two of the groups that are in this, together with the crop insurance and reinsurance people, dairy people, and so on. All of the usual suspects, they're in on this. They unite, even though on more parochial issues, they're at each other's necks. Why? Well, there are billions of dollars at stake. And there's a clear place where you go to influence in order to get at that federal gravy train. Now, I've done some calculations on this. If you took the nominal federal subsidy to agriculture, that $11 billion that I told you about, divided it up by 330 million people in the United States, that's $33 a year that subsidy costs us. If you went to the extreme and wanted to do that same calculation for the $60 billion that the federal government gave U.S. agriculture last year, that goes up to $181 for each one of us. Here's the principle of political science. When it's very clear what is at stake, and when the stakes are big, you can get a small number of people to organize in order to curry for those stakes. But when the cost is spread out over a large number of people, there isn't sufficient motivation for all the rest of us to organize for either $33 per year cost or $181 per year cost to resist what these folks are pursuing as their self-interest. So the big question for us is, can we actually identify, kind of like with the astrobiological perspective, what is actually going on and organize in order to resist these folks that are essentially continue to make a mockery of the governmental system, which you all know, famously is described in the epithet of business surviving in the United States by socializing cost and privatizing gain. That's actually what's going on. And until we all realize that that's what's going on and actually align against the interests of the private sector, rather than continue to hold them up, as the paragons of American success and the creators of jobs and all of the usual stuff that goes into the political rhetoric, we're going to be trapped in the situation that we're talking about right now.
Thanks, Ricardo. We have one maybe easier question to answer, although still really impactful, from Will. Could you recommend a mid or entry-level book for someone looking to understand this topic better?
There is no single book that covers what we've talked about here, but there's lots of really good books that I do recommend for pieces of it. I first of all do recommend Adam Frank on the Astrobiological Perspective. Just about anything that Adam Frank has written, whenever I see one of his books, I read the same. But then closer to home, I'm going to actually disclose my Bible. I mean, my whole life is dedicated to try to make what I read in this book come into being. It's a book by an economist called Willard Cochran. Willard Cochran served in the USDA as the economist that established what is today the Economic Research Service back in the early 60s. And He wrote a book toward the end of his life where he basically summarized everything that he'd learned. And it is called The Curse of American Agricultural Abundance. First 4 chapters are kind of the history of how we got into the mess. Chapter number 5 is essentially redemption. It's what do we do about this? I think it's brilliant. Some of the bullet points in there, if I had to extract, would have to do with such things as we actually should transfer agricultural production in such a way that it is about what today we would call resilience, and in his day it was called green payments. We actually should have an antitrust unit within the USDA that actually battles the private sector and supports the interests of farmers. There's a number of ideas like that in there. They're very coherent, very informed by somebody that understood the policies within the USDA because he helped to formulate some of those very policies. So those are some of the things that I would recommend reading for sure.
And
I could
John,
go on, but I noticed we're running out of time.
And we are remarkably out of time. And I just want to say thank you so much for being here and really giving us so much to consider about these big questions around climate change and the public good and the general welfare of all of us as we address some of these global challenges. So thank you again. I wish we could answer some more of these questions that are coming through, and I have 1,000 of my own, but unfortunately we'll have to make that part 2.
Okay, well, those questions are good. Pursue them. You don't need me to pursue those questions. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I really respect everything that you all do. Thank you for having me here today.
Thank you, Ricardo.